Thank you so much for having me today, and to everyone for joining. As I always introduce, my name is Mariko, and I'm co-founder of Social Innovation Japan and our initiative mymizu. Today I've been asked to speak a little bit about social entrepreneurship generally, and then also, I guess, to introduce a little bit about what we're doing, and I'll touch upon my own personal story too. Cool. So, who am I? You might guess from my name, but I am half Japanese, half British, and I was born and raised in London. I was actually born to a family of musicians, so I came from a very unconventional family. So I guess I never had these ideas of, I must go work for a company and do X, Y, Z. So I had a fairly free childhood, as it were. And my career has taken me across a number of different pursuits. I actually started out as a journalist and then working for the British government here in Japan. Eventually, I ended up setting up my own organization and then running a number of initiatives through that. Here we go. So when I started out as a journalist, I was covering things like the Arab Spring, the Euro crisis, the Eurozone crisis, and of course, this is sort of back in the early, I guess, 2010, 11 to 14. So things like climate change were starting to become, headline news. And it's something that we know, I guess, if you're reading the news now, we seem to be facing crises all the time. I remember back in 2011, when the Arab Spring broke out, just thinking about the complexity of the problem and how, things like climate change, things like, a small incident somewhere can set off an entire war, really struck me as how complex these problems that we're facing are. And as a journalist, I was very lucky to spend a lot of time looking into these. So looking into, what are the causes of this war, or, why is, for example, the Eurozone crisis why was it in such a mess? And now, being half British and seeing the UK leave the Eurozone, leave the EU, you can see just how complex a lot of the issues we face are. Climate change is obviously one of these biggest issues, but I always had this perspective where I was looking at it from the lens of someone who was in the UK, looking at news in the UK, but I was doing it through the lens of a Japanese newspaper. And I started to notice some really interesting things whilst I was doing that. So, I'm in the UK, I'm somewhat representing Japan there. And people obviously have this idea of, Japan is this very technologically advanced country, conversations about robots, or, I think this is the image that a lot of people have when you start talking about Japan, and they're like, wow, it's technologically amazing. And it is in many, many ways. And, following this job, I was lucky enough to be working with the British government as well, running one of their flagship campaigns, Innovation is Great. And my entire job was to promote innovation between these two countries. So you have this amazing technology, for example, being developed in Japan, whether it's in universities or companies, and equally you have the same kind of stuff happening in the UK too. And my job was to promote, how are we solving these social or environmental problems? How are we innovating to create a better world between these two countries? And something really struck me as I was doing this, and I was extremely lucky to be working with startups, with big companies, with academics, with people in all walks of life who have taken it upon themselves to tackle a problem that matters to them through their work, whether that's as an academic or as an entrepreneur or as a business leader. But especially in Japan, the way a lot of people saw problems was like, oh well, we have maybe an aid package going overseas, or there's a lot of focus on, the problems overseas or problems elsewhere that we could tackle, whether it's a government policy. But what I realized is that, this is just one example, but not everything is what it seems on the surface. So those of you who have worked here in Japan will be perhaps familiar still with one of these machines. When I was working both as a journalist and for the government, a lot of things still had to go through the fax machine, and I was really surprised by that. And then what you do realize is that as you start to scratch below the surface, there are obviously a whole bunch of problems that we face here in Japan too. And whilst we are, incredibly lucky to have, some cutting edge technologies here, we're, as a country, in many ways, what's the word? we are really blessed in the infrastructure that we have and the safety that we have as a society. But there are also these problems under the surface. So climate change is a big one, obviously. Wherever you are, you can't really get away from it. But specific to Japan, we have issues such as an aging population, rural depopulation. Recently we've seen a lot of issues being highlighted thanks to the Black Lives Matter campaigns about discrimination here in Japan. Poverty is not unknown. And as I started to scratch under the surface, I realized that whilst a lot of the attention when it comes to social and environmental issues in Japan is placed on, there's a country overseas that is having these problems, there's a lot at home as well that we can start to look at. So next, I want to look a little bit into how we tackle social and environmental problems, or how we have done so far. So generally speaking, when we say core, there's, whether it's climate change or poverty, when we start to look at these issues, there are three main players. So if you're perhaps, a government player, you'd be looking at policies or certain things that you can do in order to change the situation. We have civil society. So whether that's, organizations, or society at large looking to tackle these problems. And we also have business. So how are we solving problems through the market and through the economic system? In Japan, traditionally, we have actually relied a lot on the government to solve social and environmental issues. And so as we talk about social entrepreneurship today, I want to kind of highlight these other two areas around the market and around community organizations and what we can be doing in order to tackle these problems. So if we have a look at Japan, I mentioned that, for example, promoting innovation between the UK and Japan, what you realize is that in Japan, we have an incredibly, we have a very highly educated population. I think it ranks #1 in the world in terms of the quality. I guess it's debatable depending on where you went to school, but in terms of education, technology as well is incredibly advanced here in Japan. And there's a lot of cash. I'm sure you would agree. We have a lot of companies that are cash rich. And are currently, investing that or using that to some good. But we also noticed, and I'll introduce my co-founders in a second, but we also noticed that there are certain things missing when it comes to using those amazing resources we have to tackle social and environmental issues. So for example, even though we have one of the most highly educated populations in the world, there's often a low sort of engagement in social and environmental challenges. You wouldn't, for example, necessarily sit down to dinner and be, talking about climate change or talking about politics, which you might find in other countries. When it comes to ideas, you might have a great idea, but do you have the opportunity to share that with other people? Or to, what do you do when you want to start a new initiative? How do you, get over that first barrier and start to move? And finally, resources. So even, for example, same idea, if you come up with an idea and you want to make something happen and you want to solve a problem, what do you do then? Do you have the information, the skills, the resources that you need in order to make something happen? And realize that more often than not, people don't. And so, speaking to people, we realize that there's a big gap here when you have maybe appetite for tackling some of these problems, but not necessarily the skills and the resources that you might need. And so based on that, me and my two co-founders, Robin and Keiko, we set up this organization called Social Innovation Japan. And our big goal has been to change up the way that we tackle social and environmental issues here in Japan. So we've started out very community-based, very grassroots-based, bringing together people who have an interest in certain topics or, have an interest in starting something new themselves, and giving them the space to connect with a diversity of people, whether that's, other entrepreneurs, whether it might be people who are working in a company but want to start an initiative, or even just others who might want to support in a way that, is appropriate to them. We've run, I don't know how many events to date, but, this is an example of the kind of thing that we would do, bringing together about 150 participants on this occasion around the topic of blockchain to show the sheer depth and breadth of, the potential of the technology, the kind of problems that can be solved by it, and also, showing the diversity of the people who are involved. So when you talk about blockchain, I think it started to change now. This is probably about a year and something ago. And at the time, the conversation was still very much focused on, oh, Bitcoin, cool. And so our goal with this was to say, actually, blockchain is an incredible technology with a lot of potential. Here we have a representative from the UN's World Food Programme talking about how they're using blockchain to try and shift the way that they're doing food distribution. We had a female VC talking about the potential for the technology in Asia and around the world. We had, a government think tank talking about how blockchain could be used to increase accessibility for voting in national elections through using the technology to enable remote voting. So this is a kind of opportunity that we try and bring people together from across different industries to show that there's a whole lot of potential and to create new connections through those occasions. A second example is bringing together people to find and identify concrete solutions to problems. So as Social Innovation Japan, we would bring together people, for example, on this topic of circular economy. The people in this room were all interested in finding out how they and their companies could tackle and create a more circular economy. But we're struggling a little bit to find out, how can you do that? Specifically, how can you make that happen? And so here, our goal was to facilitate these discussions, to provide a platform for cross-sector collaboration and for people to find out whether they are an employee at a company or a social entrepreneur looking to create something new, where are the gaps and what is the potential and what needs to be solved in order to move forward. And one other example of the kind of activities we do is this thing called SDG's Pitch Night. So when someone does have an idea and they start, or maybe they're already somewhat along their journey, tackling a new a problem that they care about, often when we talk about the resources that they need or the network in order to grow what they're doing, our goal through this pitch night is to provide a platform for more people to find out about it and for people to get the resources they need in order to launch it. Unfortunately, our pitch night has been a little bit on hold due to the current situation of not being able to gather in person, but we're working on it, and I'm inspired by events like today, where you can actually connect online and create a new environment, even if we can't gather in person. So through these activities, we've obviously learned a lot. Things like just a number of people who would come to our events and say, wow, I'm so inspired, or like, I really want to do something, but I don't know where to start. There are a lot of people who want to create positive change. But we've also seen that, especially for incumbents such as businesses and governments, they often struggle to take the risks that they need in order to be really creative and come up with a truly innovative solution. And often we don't see these like successful examples. So even if a company says, yeah, sure, we want to do this, if there's no pre-existing example, it's often difficult for them to create a change. So that's actually one of the reasons we started mymizu. So mymizu it's based around a simple smartphone app that helps you to find places that you can refill your single-use bottle instead of using single-use plastic. And this actually came partly out of this workshop that I mentioned earlier, working with companies to figure out how they can tackle, the problem of waste and create a more circular economy. And so much of the feedback we received was like, we don't know how it's going to work, though. How do you make that happen? Or, we don't have partners. We can't take that risk. Consumers don't want this. So how are we going to do this? So our goal through this platform is to really show what is possible to change, show that there is consumer demand for an alternative, and actually to create that with all the partners we're working with. So, we were initially inspired by, this kind of realization that we're surrounded by our own waste. And, you can see here a number of PET bottles. And looking into the numbers, we realized, as a country in Japan, we consume 25 billion PET bottles every year. And that's enough to circumnavigate the world 128 times. So this seems like a crazy waste. And even though recycling in Japan is great, we still waste 3.9 billion bottles that doesn't get recycled. And even that which does get recycled often ends up, downgraded, and not, a PET bottle doesn't become a PET bottle again. It's also, a huge global problem. We consume 1 million single-use PET bottles every minute around the world. So mymizu is our first step solution to that, to say, if you can find places to refill your bottle, then surely you don't need to use the single use stuff. So we have 200,000 refill points globally. The innovative thing that we find that we're doing is that although we've got our users, our amazing users, helping us to map out water fountains across the world. So whether that's, train stations or parks, public places that you can refill, they are contributing to building this database so that other users can find places to refill. But we also figured that we can't rely on that alone. And we have, in Japan, we're so lucky to be surrounded by drinking water that you can, safe drinking water. So we have hotels, cafes, co-working spaces, and other businesses signing up to the platform in order that they can provide water to people who want to refill too. So this is really the true sort of cross-sector element to what we're doing. So, we have big names like IKEA, Hilton Hotels, Audi, Patagonia, these kind of places who have joined the platform. And, for them, they might not be able to get rid of single-use plastic immediately in their business. They might not be able to make the sweeping changes right now that maybe we need to in order to see a more sustainable society. But as mymizu, we can provide that first step for them to participate and actually to help to decrease the amount of waste that's being produced every day in a very, very tangible way. So to date, we actually launched in September last year. So I think when Robin joined this conference last year, we were just getting going. We were wondering where on earth this year was going to take us. In the course of this year, we have had about 60,000 downloads from around the world. Although we're very heavily focused in Japan still, it's really awesome to see this community of people growing and so many people saying, yes, I want to refill. Yes, I think this is a better alternative. And using and joining the mymizu movement. We've had over 2,500 refill spots added by our users, as well as over 600 businesses join the platform. Not any thanks to our sales, because we don't do any. We have too small a team to be actively approaching people. But, it's so heartwarming to see these businesses joining the platform saying, hey, we saw about mymizu. We think it's awesome. Like, we put out a lot of plastic waste right now through, the cups that we're giving out, but, this is the very least that we can do. And the next step we want to do is to stop our own, waste, whatever it is. So it's a really, really cool to see this community growing. And I guess, probably the most important thing is we have our users also, many of our users tracking the bottles that they've saved through the app. So here, the last time I checked, we just had over 45,000 bottles saved, thanks to our users who are tracking their refills on the app. And this really comes back to what I was saying earlier about companies saying, oh, but a consumer isn't asking us for, a more sustainable solution, so there's nothing we can do. If we have people tracking their refills, if we have people using the app, then we can show them that there is a demand for an alternative. And we've been very lucky. We've had a whole host of companies coming to us and saying, we think what you're doing is great, and we know we need to change what we're doing, so work with us and maybe we can come up with solutions together. That's for drinks companies, it's for non-drinks companies who realize that they can still work with us to create something new. And we think this is the power really of social entrepreneurship. So when these big companies haven't been able to fill a gap, we can come in and say, hey, look, this is what we can do, and if we work together, we can solve these problems together. This is just on a final note, the challenge we just launched today. We'll be doing some comms very soon. But our next big step as mymizu will be to launch these challenges. So we're working with a company who has over 2,000 of their employees currently tackling a mymizu challenge to see as a company how many single-use PET bottles they can save. And if we can get these people for just 1 month refilling their mybotoru, instead of buying single-use bottles, that's thousands of people who have been able to change their behavior. And we have a lot of companies who are interested in doing this with us, schools, also local governments. So I really hope that we can continue to spread this movement and tackle this problem of single-use plastic and create a more sustainable society together.